to My Jewish Learning Torah Study with Rabbi Moishe Steigmann. I apologize for the delay. Mara, as you know, who usually hosts this, is having some computer glitches. So I hopped on real quick so that somebody could host on the tech side of this. It is lovely to see you all, and I am looking forward to my bonus study session this morning too. So Rabbi Steigmann, I think we are all in.
Great.
Yep, so go ahead and get started.
My name is Moishe Steigmann, the Mindful Rabbi, and a huge thank you to My Jewish Learning. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. What's your name again?
Rachel Steinerman.
Rachel. All right, thank you so much, Rachel, for jumping in. I got an email from Mara a few minutes ago that she's having some computer glitches too. So we always appreciate everything Mara does to host and to run the meeting. And thank you to Rachel for jumping in last minute as well. I see some familiar faces, so it's wonderful to see some of you again. And to those of you with whom I have the pleasure and honor of learning with and teaching for the first time, thank you so much for joining. I run a nonprofit organization called Own Your Judaism, where your life journey and your Jewish journey meet. I also run an organization called Ohel Ayala, which is based in New York, where we offer free walk-in high holiday services and discounted Passover seders. One thing that I always say is, I know there are how many people are on here, right? I mean, close to 200 people on here. So I love things in the chat. Renee, the chickens are doing great. There are so many comments in the chat, and I'll get a lot of questions too. Rachel, if you have the opportunity to try to filter some of them as we go, that's great. You can see I try to be responsive to the chat as well. There are oftentimes questions that I miss simply because of time and simply because of volume. Here is my email address. Please feel free to reach out anytime with questions, with follow-up. Sometimes I email back pretty quickly. Sometimes it takes me a couple of weeks, but I do love hearing from all of you. All right, without further ado.
Rabbi Steigmann, I'm sorry to interrupt. You would like me to read the chat and pause you, and when I see something worth discussing, hold questions for the end? How do you normally like to do this?
Yes. In other words, if you see something remarkable or incredible, please feel free to jump in. Like I said, I'm usually pretty good at going through the chat as well. But if something comes up and you think there's a great pause moment, always feel free, Rachel, to interrupt me. That's not an issue. All right. Our Torah portion this week is Parashat Hukkat. And sometimes you watch a movie or you read a novel and the progression is linear. You get part one of the story, then you go to part two of the story, then you get to part three of the story. Sometimes it wraps up in a neat bow. Sometimes you get all of these phenomenal cliffhangers. Sometimes you watch a movie, sometimes you read a novel where it jumps back and forth. And you're left trying to figure out what is going on at the end. And sometimes it seems entirely disjointed in one ways or the other. I look at Hukkat more like the second, because we have one story at the beginning all about the red heifer, which is entirely disjointed from almost anything else in the Torah. Then we go through a couple of different chapters back and forth about military conquest, about fighting and engaging some of the people and potential enemies whom the Israelites are encountering in their wandering in the desert. We get two different stories of deaths. Both Miriam and Aaron, Moses' sister and Moses' brother, die in this parsha, and we see the reaction, in some ways the tragic reaction of the Israelite people to the loss of two of their cherished and beloved leaders. And then we get to perhaps one of the most confusing and also compelling in stories in the entire Torah. Every time I read it and every time I teach it and every time I reference it, the simple question is why? Why did this happen? Yes, Roberta, Miriam as well. This is exactly right. Miriam is one of the people who dies, and certainly we have some tragic after effects from her death. I usually use Safaria. I'm sharing my screen right now. I usually use Safaria as my kind of go-to text for translation. All right. So once again, just the brief context is right before this in Numbers chapter 20. We do see that Miriam dies here in our parsha. The community is without water. Miriam is associated with water through Miriam's well. Water, of course, symbolizing life and giving and sustenance. So we can see the incredible, powerful connection that the Israelites have, not only physically in terms of their physical sustenance, but their emotional connection, and in some ways reliance and dependence on Miriam as well. Rachel, thank you for linking the Safaria as well. So the community is without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron. Right? This is sadly often human nature. I'm frustrated. I'm upset. I'm scared. I'm nervous. I'm gonna lash out at the people or the person who's right in front of me, and or the person that I feel like I can blame. So Miriam passes, and the people right away begin to quarrel with Moses and with Aaron. This, by the way, is a recurring theme, particularly in the book of Numbers, where there is a kind of rebellion against Moses and Aaron and or God. There's a sin, there's a punishment, there's apology, and then you go through the cycle again. This is really a recurring theme throughout, particularly the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. So then here we are in verse 3. The people quarreled with Moses, saying, if only we had perished when our family perished at the instance of Adonai. Right? Death is better than this. Shakespeare couldn't write these kinds of wails with more lament and more tragedy. If only we had died instead of suffering what we're going through now. And then yet again, more tragic lament, right? Why have you brought Adonai's congregation? Why, Moses, have you brought your people into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Right? Gail, you're one step ahead of us with your comment. Please hold on to that for a moment. Why did you make us leave Egypt to bring us to this wretched place, a place with no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates? There isn't even water to drink. Right? You almost have that cliche image of the world's smallest violin playing a sad, sad song just for you. Now, don't get me wrong here. Yes, I'm happy to show the parallel Hebrew. Thank you, Mike. Don't get me wrong here. Certainly the, hold on one moment, please. Certainly the Israelites are in grieving and in mourning, right? There's absolutely no doubt about that they are grieving and mourning. And people, when they are grieving, people, when they are mourning, we're not in our most rational and logical selves. And yet we see this pretty extreme reaction once again. Better to have stayed in Egypt as slaves than for us to be here. Right? It's almost this impossible, inconceivable nostalgia to be slaves again, rather than to deal with the current grief that they're facing. Now, I also want to have a little bit more rahmanis, a little bit more compassion for the Israelites. They're still in their relative infancy as people, right? You know, no one should have, we all go through grief. Grief is part of life. No one should have to go through tragic grief, and certainly not a kid, right? Certainly not a child having to go through tragic life. The Israelites are still in their relative infancy as free people. And the idea of fleeing back to the only place that you know, there's something I can certainly understand here. And yet at this point, yes, Lois, thank you, right? In many ways, it's like they're grieving for themselves, not for Miriam, right? What this tragedy has happened, woe is me. I've been able to scan a little bit, Rachel, the comments in the chats. Anything big that I've missed so far that you think I should give a couple moments of attention to? And this doesn't mean that one chat is more important or less important than the other. Again, we have limited capacity here. And I'll put my email once again. Please feel free to email me if we don't get to a question or a comment that you have. Rachel?
Yeah, well, Gail had a thought that it had actually never occurred to me in the many times I've seen this Torah, I've read through this Torah portion, which is that maybe Moses struck the rock because of his grief, that compromised his judgment. And that really jives with something that Ara is saying, which is that grief and anger can often come as a pair, that sometimes feelings of grief do raise feelings of anger. And Mike asked a question that I don't fully understand. So maybe Mike, you can clarify, or maybe I missed something. He wants to know if you can show parallel Hebrew. And
yes,
we have
I did
hand raised
That's
as well.
Yeah, so I did the parallel Hebrew right now. That's on the screen now. Yeah.
So okay, got it.
Yeah.
All right. And so let me invite
So before Jack, before your comment, well, let's hold off on the hitting the rock or tapping the rock because we haven't yet gotten to the text. So we'll get there shortly. Certainly grief and anger often go hand in hand. I think the idea of like the 5 or the 7 stages of grief and them coming in linear order, I think that's been a little bit debunked. That we know that as a response to tragedy, various emotions often well up, and yes, grief and anger often go hand in hand. So thank you for those comments. Jack, you had a question or a comment, please?
I don't know if I'm ahead of this, but Moses not only hit the rock, but he hit it twice. Yeah. And it's not emphasized enough. I think this man was not only discouraged, but he could not tolerate these people anymore, which is one of the reasons why God deals with them the way he does.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jack, and I don't disagree at all. And once again, so many of you are 2 steps ahead of me. So we've had a lot of questions and comments about the rock. Let's get to that in the text because I'd really love to hear more of your reflections, both on why we think Moses reacted this way, what that means for him as the leader, and why we think God reacted with the consequence that God brought, right? All right. So Moses and Aaron came away from the congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Fell on their faces is both a literal literal comment and also a figure of speech. In the days of the Torah, when people wanted to petition God, when they wanted to pray to God, they would literally fall on their faces, nifilat apayim. And in our traditional services as well, I have seen this most commonly in Orthodox synagogues as part of daily services after reciting the Amidah, which is essential prayer in Judaism. We do.
What do you want?
We do nifilat apayim. We do tachanun, where we literally fall on our arms like this and offer penitentiary prayers. So this idea of falling on their faces is both incredible supplication, and it's also something, it's a practice that we've continued in various communities today, literally this pleading and beseeching of God. So they beseech God, and as we see at the end of verse 6, the presence of the Lord, the presence of Adonai appeared to them, and Adonai spoke to Moses saying, you and your brother Aaron take the rod, this famous rod, this rod that Moses, the rod.
I caused that mute by pressing the wrong button. I'm so sorry.
No problem, no problem. If only people could do that to me intentionally many times in life. So you're all good.
I've had family members who felt that way about me too.
Exactly. Right. So if only Moses, this rod that Moses used to lift the sea parts, the rod that Aaron used cast down, it becomes a snake. This rod that has all these wondrous properties. Take this rod and assemble the community. And before their very eyes, order the rock to yield its water. Thus you shall produce water for them from the rock and provide drink for the congregation and their beasts. Right? Take this rod, This rod, I don't want to say this magic rod, but this rod with these magical properties and capacity, use it, issue a command to the rock, and thus before the entire congregation, water will emerge. This doubting congregation, this complaining congregation, this grieving congregation performed this wonder before their eyes. And potentially some of the hope might be, again, more hope, more comfort, more confidence, more sustenance, maybe more belief that even the loss of Miriam, we will still be sustained, renewed faith in God. So Moses takes the rod from before Adonai as he had been commanded. Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock. And then Moses says to them, listen, you rebels. And the Hebrew here is compelling. The Hebrew is morim. And morim is the same kind of root as Miriam, right? So Miriam literally means bitter. Maror, Miriam, bitter. Mayim morim, bitter waters. There's this weight that Miriam carries with her, this connection with bitterness. Sometimes it's the water, and look at this bitter reaction, and look at Moses' response. Moses, by the way, has always been the defender of the people, right? The Hebrew word for prophet, navi, I think a better English word is intercessor than navi, because really the role of the navi is not only to prophesy, to share God's teachings with the people, but also to intercede on behalf of the people with God. Something Moses does time and time and time and time again. Every time the Israelites transgress, every time they sin, Moses says, God says, I'm going to punish the people. Moses says, you can't do it, God. You have to be more gentle with them. Or if you're really going to punish them, punish me too. Right? This is Moses. And this very same Moses is now rebuking the people. I think it was Gail who suggested Moses is going through his own grief right now. Right? Maybe this is a reflection of Moses' grief. Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this anger, water for you out of this rock? This patient, loving, generous Moses now acts out of anger, perhaps other emotions. And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Out came copious, abundant, overflowing water, and the community and their beasts drank. Rachel, I think this is a good point in this story. Pause. Questions, comments that you've seen jumping up. I haven't been incredibly attentive to the chat room here. I'm putting my email in again. Please.
It's hard to parallel process. Ginny points out that also, not having water is a valid concern and may all in and of itself raise a whole host of feelings that
absolutely. Now I would love to imagine if I were an Israelite person at this time. I don't know that I'd have the discipline to do this, but I'd love to imagine if I were an Israelite at this time, I would say, dear Moses, dear Aaron, and dear God, we're in the midst of grief right now. We're suffering and mourning the loss of Miriam. And as much as we want to give our love and compassion and grief toward that, we also recognize that Miriam's passing also takes away our sustenance. Aaron, Moses, God, please help us find water so that we can nourish our physical souls, so that our spiritual souls can continue to mourn and lament the loss of Miriam. I wish I'd be able to say that if I were an Israelite. But I can't imagine that's realistic. First of all, when we're grieving, we're hardly rational. And that's okay. Second of all, as I mentioned before, this is an adult Moishe Steigmann. This is the mindful rabbi using that language. I don't know that I would have said those words years ago, let alone if I'm 5 years old or 6 years old or 2 years old. Right? I can have sympathy and empathy for all the various responses here. But we can also start to see why none of these healthy responses is the course, why the Israelites are responding the way they do, and why Moses and Aaron respond the way they do. Rachel, did something else come up that really grabbed your attention?
This is such a great crowd. You guys are bringing the questions and comments so quickly. It's also challenging for me to listen and scan the comments. But a couple quick questions I think we can address. Hal asks, points out that Moses is constantly dealing with, the rebels, Korach's rebels, other rebellions. He has to put them down all the time. And then also Moses, of course, has to turn around and defend the people from God's anger, and asks, who defends Moses?
Yeah, and this is one of the these are one of the ubiquitous questions for anyone who is in a leadership position, right? It's one of those ubiquitous questions. Where does that person go? I'm just looking at my bookshelf. I forgot the name of the book. I'm seeing if I can scan it quickly. This was a powerful book that I read in rabbinical school. It's something like The Wounded Healer or something like that, where as clergy, right? If you're the rabbi of a synagogue, if you're the leader of an organization, if you're the head of school of a Jewish day school, right? And I'm thinking about my friend and colleague, here at the community day school. When things are difficult, who do you go to? Your job as a leader is to get the wounded healer. Yes, thank you, Mike. The responsibility of the leader is to defend the people. Who gets the leaders back? And we can see that there's often a point in leadership where we need a break. This is why the idea of a sabbatical has come up. This is why recent studies have shown that often the life cycle of a head of school at a Jewish day school is around 6 years, because there's a point at which you need a break, right? And your capacity to offer your best has greatly diminished. I think that's one of the things we're seeing here. I mean, this is getting years and years and years. Moses defends the people. Moses helps them. Moses stands up to Pharaoh. Moses stands up to God. Moses does all of this work. It's also possible Moses is simply burnt out, right? He's done his job tenfold, and now he seems to be burnt out. So that's yet another possibility here. And again, sometimes out of frustration, enough is enough. For anyone who's been a teacher or a parent or a babysitter or a camp counselor, right? The kid does this, the kid does this, the kid does this, the kid does this. We're cool, we're calm, we're collected. And then they do one more thing, and all of a sudden we erupt, right? Which is an overreaction to the last thing that's done. It's the proverbial straw in the camel's back. This could be that moment for Moses. I see.
Rabbi Steigmann, we also have an interesting question about magic. That's the kind of question I often get into.
Yes.
I wanted to invite your screen name is A Shula Yisrael so I'm not sure what your first name is, but to ask a question, because I saw she had a good comment in the chat too, and I see your hands up.
Great, thank you.
Shalom.
We'll do that, and then we'll respond to magic, and then we'll keep going with the text. So please.
All right, absolutely. Yes, and I do go by A Shula or just Shula.
Okay, great.
So I, in reading this week's Torah portion, I was really looking at the parallels between it and Korach, and how I was reading about the time in between from Korach until this portion, that it could have possibly been years in between. But in Korach, Moses seems to really step up against the rebels at that time, and he starts saying and doing things where we don't hear God speaking to him and directing him upon as to what to do with the rebels. And so I'm wondering if there's a parallel there where, okay, Moses, you have taken authority and really acknowledge the fact that you're in this position of leadership to the people, but you still have to take a step back and recognize when you have to fall under someone else's authority as a leader yourself. And I think that in this instance, that's what happened. when I parallel, I was just, wondering why is this coming right after this last story, so.
I love the parallel because in many ways this highlights just how that parallel highlights just how out of character Moses' reaction in our parsha here is from his typical behavior, right? There are times before when Moses has said, "I'm going to consult with God," right? A couple of chapters ago with the daughters of Tzlofchad, when Moses was asked a legal question, he didn't know the answer. He has no problem consulting with God. He has no problem petitioning with God. He has no problem saying arguably the three hardest words in the English language, which is "I don't know," or "I need help." Moses has no problem doing that. He also seems to have incredible discernment about when to kind of recruit God or others to help, and when to say, you know what, I got this. This is my responsibility. With Korach, there was a challenge to his leadership. He's not going to get God to defend him. He's not going to do all of this. He's going to say, hold on a moment here. Let's try to figure this out. And throughout the Korach story, he went to Korach's followers time and time again and said, hey, this is not going to end well for Korach. Please turn back now. Stay away from the path that you've taken before you get drawn into the consequence that is about to befall Korach, right? What a remarkable response as a leader, as opposed to reacting emotionally, as opposed to responding out of anger and frustration. He collects himself and then responds in many ways as a model leader should. He is so different in this parsha from almost any other time we've seen him, right? And jumping ahead, perhaps this is the reason why the consequence for Moses is he's not allowed into the land of Israel to lead the people, which again seems like a harsh reaction from God. We're going to see that happen shortly. But maybe this is simply the recognition, Moses, I think your time as a leader has ended, right? This isn't the punishment. This isn't you're in trouble. This isn't God angry necessarily at Moses. This is that recognition that the Moses of Hukkat is different from the Moses who responded to Korah. You're not the right person to continue leading. You've done your responsibility with such aplomb, with such grace and such dignity. And sometimes it's the right time to step away from being a leader. This is potentially your time. So that might be one reason why God responded as God did. There are certainly other possibilities as well. Magic. When I said magic, I really meant magic in quotes. No, the Torah doesn't really believe in magic in that kind of sense of like Korach's magic or those kinds of things. That being said, there simply is something supernatural and beyond human capacity that exists in the Torah, which almost exclusively comes from God, right? This is God's domain of doing something beyond the natural order of people. So when I said that the rod has these kinds of magical powers, I was referring to God's capacity beyond the typical natural order. So thank you for that clarifying question. I didn't quite mean magic in the same way of David Blade making the Statue of Liberty disappear. I see we have a couple more hands. I see we have a couple more questions. There's always so much to do. Raphael, we haven't heard from you yet, so let's take a moment and hear from you. Jack, I see you have another question or comment. I'm going to ask a little patience because I do want to hear from Raphael and perhaps go a little bit more into the text as well. Raphael, please, thanks for your patience.
Hello, Rab. Regarding the death of Miriam, Rash wrote that the death of the righteous is compared to the atonement of sacrifice. How can we understand this?
So Rashi was saying that the death of the righteous is compared to or is proportional to. Say that one more time. The death of the righteous is. You're on mute again, Raphael.
Raphael, we can't hear you.
Sorry, now okay. Is compared to the atonement of the sacrifice, the death of the righteous.
So I think what Rashi is trying to suggest is that, if we look at Miriam's passing and we look at the the response of the community. We look later on in this parsha at Aaron's passing. Aaron dies in this parsha as well. We see how the community wails and mourns for 30 days. This is where we get our custom of shloshim, right? That the relative righteousness of the person is going to kind of trigger the response of the people. Like the consequence for their passing has reverberating effects in proportion to their righteousness and their commitment. And it's not always a one-to-one. We certainly know, right? It's not, we shouldn't always look at it 100% one-to-one, but we can see the deep, deep, deep impact of the loss of Miriam and the loss of Aaron on the Israelite people. I think that is in direct proportion to the impact that they had. And in particular, when they wail and when they mourn Aaron also for 30 days, for so long, Aaron was always the kind of, Moses was always the advocate for the people. Aaron was always the almost defender or justifier of the people. I got your back, right? And always seemed to take the people's side, right? He's almost like the grandparent, right? The grandkid calls the grandparent and says, my mom, my dad, my parent, they're doing this, they're doing this, they're doing this. You call the grandparent, right? That's how Aaron kind of plays a role for the Israelites. So you put all this together and you can start to see the kind of response in proportion to the import of the person who has passed. So I know there are more questions. I know there are more comments. I love the quick quip about Moses getting bolder and bolder. I love slapstick humor anytime. Keep throwing that my way. I do want to just get
Rob Platts always supplies those. And the lucky thing is we do the Torah every single year. We can do this again next year.
Exactly. So I at least want to go to one more verse, and then I'll leave the rest of the time for comments, reflections, and questions too. But Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, that alone we can unpack so much there. Therefore, you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them. And I've already seen punishment fitting the crime, overreaction. And this line is so powerful. There are other commentaries, again, which suggest that it's almost as if Moses didn't trust God. Because God says, speak to the rock, command the rock, and instead Moses taps or hits the rock. So one possibility is Moses didn't seem to trust God. And if Moses doesn't trust God, that can seep throughout the entire community. Or maybe it's because Moses did this in the sight of all of the Israelite people. Maybe if this were a private command where God said to Moses, look, it's the two of us right now. Talk to the rock, and instead Moses hits the rock, God can say, okay, Moses, let's step back and debrief here. But because this is in public sight, right? It's one thing if I make a mistake in private and apologize to someone. It's something else if I slander someone in public. Because this was done in public, right? This is in front of everyone that Moses seemed not to trust or seemed to disobey God. The consequence has to be different. So there are all these different commentaries that have come up, and I don't necessarily espouse one more so than the other. And I see there are so many comments about supporting and or pushing back against some of these commentaries. And by the way, no one should ever feel that they can't suggest, oh, this is wrong, or I disagree with this commentary, or I have a different viewpoint. One of the beauties of the Torah, and this is something that one of my teachers, Dr. Robbie Harris, said about the Torah, is it's delightfully ambiguous. Because there's purposeful ambiguity here, we get to delight in different commentary, which means the only kind of rule about commentaries is that you, and I said rule in quotes for those of you who are listening to this or don't have their screen on, rule in quotes, the only quote unquote rule is that any commentary you offer needs to be defensible. You have to be able to defend it by the text. So if you can ground your commentary in the text, feel free to disagree and debate with other people. That's the beauty and joy of Torah study. Rachel, was there something big in the chat that I missed during this point, and then we can get to Jack once again?
I think there are nice comments interacting with yours, but I think you can keep moving.
Great. Jack, and then I don't know if it's Andrea or Andrea, but Jack and then Andrea. Jack, you're on mute, I believe.
You know, you can hear me now, I assume.
Yes.
Yes.
The staff has always represented to me a shepherd staff, and Moses throughout Exodus and into this has used the staff to represent his power, not necessarily his power to control a situation. Here, God, and before he used the staff many times, here God tells him to pick up the staff, but not use it. I didn't understand that, because Moses at this time has benefited the Israelites by leading them for a long time. We now need a military man because they're going into the land of Israel, and that's going to be Joshua. My feeling is it would be a real come down if Moses went into the land of Israel as a second-rate citizen or leader. God, by doing what he does him a favor, because they remember him for what he did, not for taking second place to Joshua once they're in the land of Israel.
Yeshikah, thank you, Jack. And one other comment about Moses, then Andrea will get to you. And I think we need to wrap up at that point, right? Rachel, we're usually pretty vigilant about the 11:15 East Coast end time.
Well, I'm not the usual host, but Mara, who owns this event, says that we can go an extra couple of minutes to compensate for a slightly late start.
Okay, no problem. All right, so yes, so Jack, that's also something that the rabbis, something that we can really laud Moses for as well, is as soon as Moses is given the command to anoint Joshua to take his place, he does that immediately. Right away, he anoints Joshua, and right away he publicly says Joshua is the guy who's going to take you into the land. Moses' grief is going to come afterwards. And we talk again, it would be understandable if Moses resisted, didn't want to do it. We see oftentimes people in a leadership position who don't always leave of their own volition. It's a very difficult transition. And the outgoing leader, understandably, sometimes, not so understandably, other times, makes that transition very difficult. That's not what Moses does. So he makes the transition as smooth and impactful as possible. So thank you, Jack, for your comments and reflections. Once again, I'm going to post my email. I just post my email again here in the chat. Please, please, please feel free to follow up with any other questions, any other comments. And Andrea, I'm going to put you on hold just for one more moment. David, yes, there are oftentimes there are parallels to the current political situation. I'm always kind of cautious. Do I make a caveat at the beginning or not at the end? This happens to be our Parsha this week, right? And I make no political comments. We can interpret this and apply this in many different ways. I'm not bringing this Parsha because of the political situation. That being said, we're in an election season, and there are ways that we can apply some of these questions about leadership as we are trying to determine what choice we want to make in the upcoming election. I say that with no political leaning whatsoever, partly because MyJewishLearner.com, I presume, and I know Own Your Judaism are 501c3s. We're not allowed to make political statements. That being said, there are certainly political applications throughout the Torah. That's part of what I find so compelling, is that we are able to really apply all of these things to Jewish life. Andrea, thank you for your patience. And then after your question or comment, we'll wrap up and we'll wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. You're on mute, Andrea.
Okay. I have two quick comments.
Please.
First, I take issue with this being a public disobeying of God's commandment, because there's nothing in the text that says the people knew what the commandment was. For all the people knew, God told him to strike the rock twice. So I don't think that holds water, to make a little bit of a
No,
the other thing is, this is the second time in the same location that Moses is told to get. In Exodus, he's told, and it's the same place. We're told it's Meribah, the place of strife, that to get water from the rock. And the first time he is told to strike it. So it's as a reader, I'm wondering, why in the world was he given different instructions? And when he was told to strike, when he was told to strike last time and striking worked, it's not too surprising that that's what he would do the second time. So those are, I just wanted to make those two comments.
So to everyone who was asking before, who defends Moses? Who has Moses's back? The answer is Andrea Shapiro. She's the one here who has Moses's back, right? I mean, Andrea's saying, first of all, I never thought about that, Andrea, that we don't know if we can in some ways actually presume that God's instruction to Moses and Aaron was private, because Moses they left the congregation, they went to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and God spoke to Moses. So for all we know, this is not public disobedience, because we had no idea what the instruction was. And not only that, defense attorney Andrea says, right, it's entirely reasonable both for Moses and for the Israelites to have Moses tap or strike the rock, because that's what he did last time. Andrea, I never thought about those. Thank you so much. So a huge thank you to all of you, both for the privilege of learning with and from me, and also for the opportunity for me to learn with and from you as well. Thank you to Rachel for jumping in and to hosting and facilitating our partial learning this morning. And thank you again to Mara for the invitation, the opportunity to teach with you as well. If you want to stay connected, please feel free, again, either to email me or jump onto ownyourjudaism.org. You can join my email list or follow me on Facebook or all the kind of social media things. And thank you all so much for joining. And to everyone who is celebrating Shabbat in any capacity, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Rabbi Steigmann, and thank for a beautiful teaching. And thank you to all of you for such insightful thoughts and comments. And it was a pleasure to be a guest in this space this week and get to participate and learn from all of you. We'll be here in 1 week's time.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Bye, everyone.